Yeah, hi everybody. Welcome to PR's talk on Naga Saga. And my association with PR goes back to, I think, a very long time ago, probably the early 90s, when I was in Delhi and I was in Kalprovich, and so was PR. And still remember we used to go for bird counts to Sultanpur as part of the KV gang. Subsequent to that, I lost touch with her. She did her PhD, went to the US, and came back to Terry. I think more than a decade ago. But the Nagaland story and this saga actually began 3-4 years ago when Pia, when she was with Terry, was undertaking a community conservation project in Nagaland in Zuniboto. And one day, Pia was in Dehradun and we caught up at home, and she said, Sanjay, can you help us with the livelihood component of this program? And per se, I'm very wary of getting involved with large NGOs. I mean, I have this thing that most large NGOs spend a lot of money, and I have very little outcomes to show for at the end of it. But Pia was a friend, and I said, okay, Pia, let me go ahead and help you. And one thing that I can say, I mean, she's going to tell the story of what they've done in this location. I was very pleasantly surprised that despite being a large NGO, Pia and her team, Siddharth, Yatish, and a number of other people that I, won't name here, the passion that they showed in this location was incredible. And I think despite being large, you can be passionate and you can be successful. And that's what I think Pia has done in this location along with the team. So I'll hand over to you. Tell us your story, Pia.
Thank you so much, Sanjay. I think that's the nicest thing you said to me in 20 odd years.
Oh my God.
Yeah, seriously. So that doesn't say much for the compliments you actually dish out. But actually now I'm affiliated with your Titli Trust as well, although only in a very, very small way. So I'm going to take you on a Naga saga today. But before I start, I'd really like to thank Delhi Bird and Sanctuary Foundation. Now, Nikhil and I have been discussing this talk for the last 3-4 months. And he was like, everybody's going through COVID hard times. We don't want to hear sad stories of hunting. We want something exciting. So what I cleverly did was I decided to do this talk, just change the title to a Naga saga, and then actually talk about exactly what I want to. So I just like to start by saying that it's the beginning of my Naga saga. I have actually only worked in some of the areas, in Wokha, in Zuniboto, in the heart of Nagaland, and there's still much to explore of Nagaland. But when I was at Terry, we actually started a study looking at, the community conserved areas of Nagaland and trying to understand what are the rituals and practices and folklore which actually contribute to conservation in the area. So in fact, it was my then colleague in Terry, Siddharth Edeke, who went exploring to actually discover a place where we could carry out these studies. We didn't want to go to areas which were well known, like Honama, the conservation story there is really well known, or Sendinu, and somehow or the other he blundered into the Sema community, the Sema tribal community in Zuniboto, which is really about 10-12 hours away on a terrible road right in the middle of Nagaland. And so that's how the Naga saga, my Naga saga, and that of all my colleagues actually started in Nagaland. Now, I just like to get into the background because it really explains how conservation, how governance works. I don't want to bore you with too many details, but Nagaland is actually a republic of villages. And as you know, the Naga tribes are warring tribes. They're fiercely independent. And they've actually continued and maintained that independence today in their whole governance system. So each village has complete autonomy. They govern their resources. They actually dispense justice. They discuss all the development activities which have to happen in an area. And they actually follow their traditional patterns of governance. So each village has to have a village council, which also includes the hereditary Gauboras, the men in red, as it were, who are the chieftains of an area who traditionally actually governed a village. So they've managed to maintain this, and the Indian constitution has actually recognized their rights through their customary rights under Article 371A of the Indian constitution, which gives them enormous independence and freedom. So this also actually translates into how they view forests, how they own and govern forests. So for example, almost 93% of the forests, of the rivers, all the natural habitats in the state are actually owned by local communities. So they may be owned, they're privately owned. It could be individuals, it could be district or village councils, it could be clans. And because of all the management which they've actually carried out in the area, Nagaland, almost 80% of the state is still forested today, of which almost 40% is dense forest. So this is an example of communities who have been protecting their lands, protecting their forests, also because of their various traditions, which I'll be talking about as I go through my saga on Nagaland. But what's in terms of the protection of forests, they really are not given any funds by the government. The Nagaland Village and Area Council Act requires them to maintain proper maintenance, proper protection of the forests. But what's interesting again of Nagaland, the whole community ownership, the local self-governance, is that as recently as in 2002, they also came up with the Communitization of Public Services and Institutions Act. Now, even though that's not really pronounceable, it basically gives local communities ownership and management of a range of activities, including biodiversity conservation, ecotourism, water. So really, if you want to do anything in Nagaland, you have to go and you have to talk to the village council, you have to talk to the men in red, you have to get everybody on board, and which also makes your task easy, because then people will actually facilitate you and decide right in the beginning whether they want you to work with them, want you to work in that area or not. So just a little background, a lot of you are familiar with Nagaland. So you know that the local people, they actually clear a patch of forest, they raise crops for a year or two, and then they let it lie fallow for about, well, the original cycle was 30 years. And this was an excellent practice because rainforests and these kind of forests, most of the nutrients are actually tied up in the biomass. They're not in the soil. So if you actually practice terrace cultivation, you need a lot of inputs to get them going. So it was a wonderful system, completely in tune with the local ecosystem. Of course, there are no utopias in life, and over time, with populations increasing, the actual fallow cycle went down quite a bit, from 30 years to 15 years to 7 to 9 years. And it's interesting, I was reading some of the British colonialists, their writings in those days, and even in the 1800s or early 1900s, they say that the cycle in certain areas, in certain Sema communities where I actually worked, went down to 3 to 5 years. So this is when actual pressures were exerted on the ecosystem, and when this wonderful system sort of deteriorated because they couldn't let the lands regenerate to forests. They couldn't leave them long enough. But everything of the Naga, their whole lifestyle is attuned to shifting cultivation, including their systems of governance. And what's interesting is because of Jhum cultivation, nobody is really poor. So even if you don't have land, even if the land is owned by the chieftain, he actually ensures that you get a piece of it to cultivate. And it's very variable across the various Naga tribes. I won't go into that. But in terms of how egalitarian they are, how they allow local, their own people to actually participate in activities, or in a sense, if they're slightly more feudal. But in the river valleys, Pani Kheti is actually practiced. Now, Pani Kheti is basically growing of paddy fields near the water in the fertile river valleys. I'd like to just talk a little bit, it might be depressing, about hunting, and you find it strange that I'm talking about hunting and conservation together. That's because we need to view hunting in a slightly different light. Most of us, we're quite shocked when we see animals being sold by the side of the street. And if you travel through Nagaland, you'll find that on the side of the little roads or the highways or even the dirt tracks, they'll be selling the hottest, well, it used to be the hottest chili in the world, the Naga mirch, there'll be pineapples, but you'll also see a range of animals there. And so, for example, this is a photograph of a Chinese ferret badger, which we saw while we were meandering through Nagaland. And this is a common sight. It's really gone down. For example, in Kohima, they used to have these massive markets where they would sell wildlife and wild animals. That has considerably decreased. But this is a sight which you still see today. And regarding customary rights, which I had mentioned earlier in Nagaland, the Wildlife Protection Act is in operation there, but most people are really not aware of it. They think because they have their customary rights and because they own the forest and they own the trees, they own the land, so they own the wildlife as well. So just to give you a background, some studies in the Northeast have found that hunting by local tribes has a major impact. At least 94 mammalian species are hunted there, and as many as 20 are endangered or vulnerable or some of the criteria of the IUCN Red List. And you'll see a range of different animals. You'll have birds, you'll have mammals, you'll have reptiles, you'll have frogs, you'll have insects or honeybees. You can basically see it all. And there's no doubt that hunting actually impacts ecological interactions. And I'm an ecologist. I'm always looking for connections and interactions wherever they exist. And studies have shown, I don't want to get too technical, but that where animals are hunted, especially the larger body ones, they get knocked out of the ecosystem. So that impacts their populations. But it also impacts their dependent tree species. And selection pressures can actually change the size of fruits which now are actually produced in a forest. And evidence is showing that this happens. Or in fact, a forest can be completely empty. It's called the empty forest syndrome. So there's no doubt that actually hunting does impact populations. And here's a very, very simple graph which I had actually studied in Arunachal. I looked at hornbill densities and I found that at hunting sites, they were significantly reduced. But what I'd like to say is that in the past, populations were lower and hunting was all carried out through traditional traps and snares. And quite probably whatever consumption of animals happened was very, very sustainable for the population. So this is a photograph from the Gosu Wildlife Sanctuary or the Osa Wildlife Sanctuary, where they're actually using fish traps in the rivers. They're carrying out their traditional practices, and they have actually banned any kind of destructive fishing in their areas. They call it, it's their own people-created sanctuary. It's not a government sanctuary at all. But apart from the use of simple traps, and in fact, the local hunters were so well versed with all the different kinds of traps and snares. They had different ones for each species, for pheasants, for the larger mammals. But they also had a lot of folklore and traditions which helped to protect the animals. So they knew their ecosystem really well. And when we go back and we actually look at some of these stories, it's quite amazing. It shows a remarkable understanding of their environment, of their biodiversity, of their habitats. But unfortunately, there have been a lot of changes, as you all know, in Nagaland. And a lot of these traditions, because they were orally passed down, are no longer, they are not available to anybody. The younger generation, like all young people everywhere, are just not interested in recording, you know, all the old folklore. And so it's completely disappearing. Yes, they do have their ceremonies where they practice this lighting without matches in the natural way, or yodeling or dancing. But a lot of the stories in the folklore is just nobody even knows them. And as J.P. Mills from in as long ago as 1926, he said that the past is just being allowed to die, and this has to be changed. So we landed up working with the Sumi or the Sema tribe, and they're supposed to be the most fierce tribe of all the Naga tribes. They're a major warrior tribe. and a very, very large tribe. So in 1969, this anthropologist writing about them said it's really strange that there's very, very little information available on them, because they're a large tribe and they occupy a large area as well. Now, it's very interesting. When I first went to Kohima, and if you ever go there, do stay at the Heritage Hotel. I mean, it has so much of history attributed to it. The Battle of Kohima was actually fought there. And I was just looking through all the beautiful rooms. They're really well appointed. And I came across this board which talked about the different district commissioners, because this used to be the district commissioner's bungalow in colonial times. And towards the end, two names popped out. One was Hutton and one was J.P. Mills. Now, Hutton in 1921 had written this amazing little treatise on the Sema Nagas. It's amazing when you see the level of detail. I mean, all the time we spent talking to the communities, we couldn't gather any information, but he has everything which is laid down. Yes, the book is a little patronizing, it's disparaging, but it's amazing record of the history and the origin of the Sema Nagas and of their folklore. So in terms of the origin of the Sumi tribe, well, the thing is they call themselves Semas, and now they have decided to call themselves the Sumi tribe. So I'm going to use it interchangeably because I'm actually used to saying Sema, which is what they used earlier. So their origins are a little obscure, but they definitely did come, after talking to a lot of people, reading Hutton, we understand that they actually came from the Chin region of Myanmar. And what's interesting is that they must have moved downwards from China, downwards via Myanmar, right to the sea, and then back up via the river valleys to the Naga Hills where they're presently found today. And that's interesting because in some of the folklore, which I'll tell you about, they talk about seas. And then you wonder, the Naga people, where do they see the sea? They're limited to the hills. But when you trace their origins, then you begin to understand where this folklore comes from. And as I said, everything is in oral tradition. Nothing has actually been written down. So these stories actually help you understand what their origins were, what they believed in, what their interconnections to nature is, because this is a wildlife talk and that's what I want to emphasize on. So it's very interesting, but the most immediate story is that the Sumi or the Sema community are very closely related to the Angami and the Lotha tribe. And story has it that there were three brothers and there was a spirit there, and they would grow a little paddy and they would place it on a stone. And then the spirit would come, and he was a very kind spirit, and he would double their paddy by nightfall. But the problem is the brothers would fight. They were all warring tribes, and it was in their nature, in a sense. They would fight with each other in terms of whose duty it was to replenish the paddy. And then the parents got really worried. They thought there would be a lot of bloodshed. So they actually burned and broke up that stone. It was like killing the proverbial golden goose. And so the spirit departed. They no longer got their paddy to multiply. And because there was scarcity, they actually had to move apart, and they dispersed and formed the three different tribes. So it basically is a story. It's a story of how you can destroy your resources and how you need to be careful what you actually do, because the impacts of your actions can be enormous. So they're a warrior tribe, and it's quite fascinating because everything in their lifestyle, even today, it actually revolves around their warrior status. So for example, the villages, whenever you travel through Nagaland, you'll find that they are atop a summit always. They're the highest peak. And this is particularly emphasized amongst the Sema tribes, because what they used to do, they were the most warring tribe. So they made sure that when the chief had an elder son, the son would move out of the village. He wouldn't actually inherit the land, but he had to move out. He had to create his own village. And in that way, they actually made sure that the ancestral village was surrounded by ties of kinship. So it would be very, very difficult for other warrior tribes to actually get into the ancestral village. They also kept their villages small because of that. And most of that zooming or cultivation was very close to the village, because then it would be easy to call upon people. So even today, when you go through Nagaland, you'll notice these features, because these villages, they date back to the 1800s or even more. Sky village, where we actually work, it was created, I think, in 1810 or so. This fantastic knowledge of biodiversity, because they are hunting communities, and so many stories which I'll be telling you about. But what is interesting is, for some taxonomic groups, for example, butterflies, they simply call them a mimi. And Sanjay is really interested in butterflies. So he used to ask them, what's the local name of that particular butterfly? And they would be like, a mimi. But if I asked them about birds, they would be able to tell me all kinds of stories about them. So obviously they value birds and mammals much more than they do insects and butterflies. And it's kind of ironical that we were providing them with training in butterfly identification as a means of developing ecotourism, which I'll come to later, because they really didn't care very much about their amimi or butterflies. But all their stories show their interconnections with nature, and it's so fascinating. Actually, the Naga tribes and the Sema tribe believe that the tiger is their brother. So they hold the tiger in high respect. And the story goes that there was once a man, a tiger, and a spirit, and they lived with their mother. But the tiger, he was wild, right? So he was always ferocious. He would sometimes even sniff around the mother and try to tear her flesh. So the mother was really fed up of him. And so one day, very cleverly, she gave them a tournament. And she said, whoever wins this tournament will stay in the village, but whoever loses has to move out of the jungle and move away. Now the spirit and the human being, they're really crafty. So they actually colluded and they beat the tiger. They cheated on the test. And so the poor tiger had to move to the jungle and look after all the other animals. But human beings were not yet done with the tiger. They continued to be as crafty as ever. So one day they sent a cat to actually meet the tiger and to tell him that, if there's any leg which is left after your hunting of an animal, just leave it on the village wall for us, because after all, we are brothers. But the cat got the story completely wrong. He went and told the tiger, whatever you hunt, you have to leave the whole of it for the human being. And so that's why the relationship is so tenuous now between tigers and human beings, because so a tiger will try and attack a human being whenever he can. But the other part of the story is very interesting. It says that when the mother died, she became one with the earth. So the tribal communities, the Naga tribal communities, worship the earth. All land is sacred because their mother was the earth in a sense. So because of all this relationship to the tiger and the leopard, it's very interesting. They have a belief of lycanthropy. And when you read again Hutton and Mills, their treatises on the Naga tribals, they talk about all the different leopard men and tiger men they actually met in Nagaland. So these men would not actually be converted into tiger. I mean, they couldn't change their form into tigers or leopards, but their soul would enter the body of a leopard or tiger. And during that period, the human being was really very sluggish and very vulnerable. At the same time, if a tiger or leopard was shot while the human soul was in their bodies, then it would reflect on the human being. And if the tiger was killed, they would die as well. So lycanthropy, it's interesting. Even today, when you talk to the people in Nagaland, Christianity, as you know, is dominant there. But a lot of people still believe in it. And they say that some of these men are still present today. I haven't had a chance to interact with them. Although there's a Mills who took photograph one of these men, and that man told everybody who was skeptical that if you don't believe that there are such things as leopard men, then you will meet a leopard at so and so spot, and invariably they did. So very strong relationships of nature and humankind, of the tribal community. They were brothers, and that's why there were lots of jennas and taboos traditionally. So if a tiger was killed, for example, his head would be ducked under water, so that if the spirit asked him, who killed you, what was the name of the human being who killed you, all the spirit could hear was the gurgling of water. So even if you killed a tiger, you had to do all kinds of things. You have to give up meat for something like 6-10 days, a lot of atonement for your sins. So it was not killing of animals was not taken lightly, but it was important in those days. It was important as a source of protein. It was a bonding between communities. It was a way of life which even continues today. So in the little blurb I had written, I had said, why does the crimson sunbird have a red neck? Well, that's another interesting story. So it appears that once upon a time, the eagles and the python, they had this huge battle for who would take over the skies and who would take over the earth. And ultimately, the python, he lost. And so there was this meeting which happened after he lost, and there was a big feast, and the body of the python was shared out amongst all the birds because the eagle who represented the birds had won. But what happened with the crimson sunbird, and his name is Idu, meaning late. He arrived late at the party. So there was really nothing much left for him. And there were just a few bits of meat, a few bits of drops of blood actually fell down on his neck. And that's why he has a crimson neck, and the whole of him is not crimson because he barely got to eat any of the meat with a few drops of blood. So this is a fascinating story of the cuckoo calls, and I won't bore you with too many more stories, just a couple of more. Because everything which they did, all their activities were actually guided by nature. So the time they would actually sow the seeds of rice was when they could hear the Indian cuckoo calling. So the story goes, there was a man called Kasu, and his dad appeared to him. His dad had died. He appeared to him in a dream, and he said, Kasu, you'll get a sign from me, and only then do you do the planting of your paddy. So Kasu said, fine. But all around him, the village, they started planting their paddy, and their paddy was doing well. It was growing big, and he got really worried. He said, my father is not going to come. He's not going to give me a sign. And so he actually went and he took the paddy seed and he went to sow it in the field. And on the way, suddenly he heard the call of a cuckoo, and it said, Kasu Papo, Kasu Papo, which basically means Kasu, your father. So that was the sign, and he actually planted the paddy seed at that point. And everybody else's paddy died for whatever reason, but his did really well. So now paddy is always actually planted when they hear the Indian cuckoo call, and that is during the breeding season. So it's between April and June. So that's basically the call. It says Kasu Papo if you listen to it very clearly. We all know about the hornbill nesting habits. They're really interesting. The female walls herself up into a cavity of a very, very tall tree, and the male comes and passes fruits till she actually breaks out and the chicks grow up and emerge. So this is a story, and this is a practice I've seen across the Northeast, not only in Nagaland, but in Arunachal amongst the Nishi community as well, that they do not actually hunt hornbills during the breeding season. Now, the actual Nagaland story of why this is the case is because there were once two men, and they were in love with the same woman. And one day they actually went hunting, and they saw a hornbill nest and they wanted to get up to the top of it. So they laid out a bamboo ladder, and one guy, he actually climbed up right to the top of the nest. But what actually happened was that the other man, because he was in love with the girl, thought this was a good way to get rid of him. So he pulled down the bamboo ladder and he left the man to starve up there in this really tall, amazingly buttressed tree. So this man was hungry. He started eating the fruit which the hornbills brought their young ones, which the male was passing to the female through the cavity in the tree. And then he decided that what he was going to do was make wings. He was going to cut off the wings and the tail feathers of the chicks and of the mother and use them to actually fly away. So the female hornbill, the mother, she actually begged him. She said, please spare my children. I promise I'll get you to safety. So he promised. And then a whole flock of hornbills appeared and they carried this man down to earth. And of course, he was really thankful and he made a promise that he would never ever actually hunt the hornbills during the breeding period. And this has really important repercussions because you're not only protecting the population of hornbills. Hornbills are amazing seed dispersers. And by protecting the hornbills and the seeds they disperse, you're protecting the forest as well. So this is really, really an amazing story of conservation and how traditional practices actually help to protect the animals. But there are lots of challenges today. The traditional traps, the traditional beliefs and systems are all getting eroded. You now have massive hunting with rifles, with guns. Fishing is not with nets and baskets and lines. It's now with batteries and currents, and very, very destructive to all the life in the rivers. And so this is having a huge impact on populations of, that is why when you travel through Nagaland, you will find that the forests are almost empty in many ways. So now I'd just like to get on to the stories of hope. There are lots of stories of hope in Nagaland. Isla Terry, we actually carried out a documentation of what are called community conserved areas, where local communities have set aside portions of forest for conservation. And what was really interesting was that almost a third of the villages have actually done this. They've created little protected forests, which they don't hunt there, or they don't collect NTFPs or fuel wood there, or they don't log there. And then, so there's so many stories of hope. And as you actually travel through Nagaland, you'll be able to see these signs in various places. And basically they're telling you that you'll be fine if you actually go and hunt in these areas. What is interesting is that the motivating factors for these community conserved areas is forest degradation, it's wildlife erosion, and it's not a new phenomenon. From the 1800s, in fact, some of the communities had realized that there were a lot of pressures on their forests, and so they had set aside these little protected areas. So this has actually been a traditional practice for quite a long time. When you want the areas, the forest to regenerate, you actually set it aside as far as possible. And most of these are actually created by the local communities themselves. It's so interesting because it's not NGOs, it's not the government who've actually created them. The local communities themselves are setting up these community conserved areas. I just like to go quickly through the Amur falcon story. You've all heard about the massive migration of Amur falcons which happens, and it seems that around 2005 to 2006, the massive influx started to occur near this newly created dam, the Doyang Dam. And so there was massive slaughtering which was actually happening there at that time. And in 2012, various people, Bano, Haralu, Ramki, Shashank, they visited the area and they saw the most dreadful sights of large-scale slaughter of these falcons. And I don't know how many of you have actually seen the Netflix program Connected. It talks about connections across the world between the rainforests of the Amazon and the sub-Saharan drylands. And the Amur falcon story is also a story of connection because this bird flies from its breeding grounds in Siberia, in China, in Mongolia, all the way to South Africa, and it stops at this area called this district called Wokha, the Doyang Reservoir. Basically, the birds stop to fatten up, and they're totally insectivorous, so they have a lot of eruptions of insects which they get to feed on. And because they were being slaughtered at a large scale, fewer numbers were actually reaching South Africa. So when this whole conservation movement by Bano started, they started talking about connections. They told the farmers in Nagaland that, look, if by killing these birds here, the South African farmers are suffering because these are insectivorous birds. They eat all the agricultural pests, and you're denying those farmers their rights. So they look for all these kind of different connections. And what's fascinating is there's a Sema story which says that when people die, their souls are carried by falcons to the hill of the dead in Boka. And it set me wondering, I was wondering if, this migration actually had happened before the Doyang Reservoir. And it's true that birds were migrating across Nagaland, the moor falcons were migrating, but I don't think they were congregating in such great numbers before the creation of Doyang. But at the same time, you realize that there are connections even across time. So, for example, while asking the communities to stop the slaughter, because Nagaland tribal communities are Christian today, they talked about the Bible where it says that certain raptors, it's not good to eat their flesh and one should not hunt them. So there were all these connections which were brought into play about how important the bird is, not just for itself, but what it does for farmers, what it does for ecosystems. And that's what we always need to emphasize when we're talking about all the different ecotourism or conservation movements. But I just like to say, I'm an ecologist and we need to look beyond the grim pictures. We need to actually understand whether the offtake, whether the hunting is unsustainable. Because it may just be that populations are not so impacted by the hunting which happens. How much of the population actually entered Nagaland? So these kind of baseline studies need to be done. Of course, it's difficult because this bird flies across so many different continents. How do you actually get the data together? But we need to try and go beyond the grim pictures, because what actually happens is the people suffer needlessly, in a sense, when you stop hunting. So because of hunting, the local village there was making almost 3.5 million rupees annually. And this actually had to pay for their children's education. And so it was a huge loss of livelihood. They made enormous sacrifices to stop hunting. And so we also need to think about that, because we sit in Delhi, in our cities where we've just about finished everything, all our wildlife, and we expect other communities to stop hunting, to give it up, to give up their traditional practices. So this is something which we really need to think about while taking up community conservation activities. The other thing was that the Doyang Reservoir had actually flooded a lot of farmland. So because of the flooding of the farmland, they lost that source of revenue as well. And ecotourism has been started there in Boka, and it's wonderful. It's an amazing sight when you hear the birds, when they come out in the thousands. It's almost like the sky becomes dark with all the wing beats. But the problem is that only a few people are benefited. There's not enough training which has actually happened there, and people are not benefiting that much from ecotourism. So one has to look at all these factors and make sure that conservation doesn't impact people adversely, and that tourism is always done the right way. So what I found, this actually is a photograph where we took some tourists in 2018 to see the Amur falcon spectacle. And the actual footfall of tourists was very low there. And now I believe there are all these agencies like Cox and Kings who are planning to actually come in and scale up tourism there, which makes you wonder how much of the benefits will actually percolate down to local communities. So we need to be really careful when we undertake these programs. I'd like to go to the story now of Tizza Valley. This is really very close to my heart. It's where I actually understood community conservation and how it works, where my colleagues and we were a very small group of people. There was Siddharth, there was Yatish, there was there was another girl for a short period of time. And we didn't know much about community conservation. We actually approached Titli Trust, we approached Sanjay, and we asked him, we said, can you help us with the training? But we basically, my colleague blundered into this area, and the people there were so welcoming. They actually offered him a great meal that he decided to stay on and continue working with the communities and to actually start a program of community conservation and ecotourism in Sky. And this has led to the Tizza Valley Biodiversity Conservation and Livelihood Network. It's a bit of a tongue twister, but the Tizza Valley is a river which runs through the villages in that area, and it connects all the villages together. So this is the village Sky, where the whole initiative actually started. And the people became so committed to conservation that all these signs you see here, they put them up themselves. They identified their own biodiversity conservation area, and they realized that everybody was looking at butterflies in certain patches. Those patches near streams where the butterflies were mud puddling were really important for conservation. And so they call those the butterfly area. But the local people actually had been active in conservation way before we even ventured in the area. They started their own community conserved area as early as in 2002, based on a resolution which was passed by the village council. But later in 2014, they actually got energized and they've set aside another area of forest, which was an abandoned room for conservation. They actually, when we worked with them, we thought they would give up hunting maybe only in their community conserved areas, but they decided to give up hunting across the entire village. And then this actually spread to the other villages, particularly to Kibakha and Ghaki village. And across the entire landscape, they made a huge sacrifice by giving up hunting. And it's not something that we asked them to do. They actually decided to do it all on their own. But as I said, when you go into a village, you have to get the permission of the village council. And on the right-hand side are the men in red. They're the Gauburas. They are the village chieftains who decide whether you can actually work in an area or not. And once they give permission, then you can go ahead. And these are some of the stalwarts of conservation in the area. And I'll be talking about them in detail a little later. But before you actually, I just like to tell you how difficult it is to work on conservation. You actually have to talk the walk. We wanted tourists to come and walk through the forests. But before that, we had to convince the local people that we needed to carry out ecotourism areas. We had to train the people. And when we went in there, they were very excited. They said, oh, you've come from the government. You're going to bring us big schemes. So we said, no, we try and bring in ecotourists here. We try and train you. So they said, ecotourists, great. So then you'll build these wonderful rest houses for us. And we said, no, what we're going to do is you will give one of the rooms in your house and the tourists will actually stay there. They'll stay with you. And no, we don't want any of the pakka, the concrete buildings. We need your houses. They want to live with you. They want to understand your culture. So there was a lot of shock throughout the villages. And then when Sanjay told them, we want to give you training on a mimi or butterflies, there was even more shock. We spent a lot of time. We had meetings, we had discussion sessions separately with the women, with the men, with the Gauburas, with the village elders, with the young people. We walked across the entire landscape to talking to people. And 6 villages were initially identified for the training program. But what actually happened was finally only 3 agreed because they thought they were suspicious of us. They thought we would take away their rights to hunt, we would take away their lands, we would take over ownership of their lands. So it's really important to work with the local community to convince them of what you want to achieve there and to make sure that you get your message across well. So of course, we had a lot of exposure visits, a lot of training programs. This is a photograph of my colleagues when they went to Pake Tiger Reserve in Arunachal. Now the hornbill is really important in Nagaland, but you rarely see it. I don't think any of the people from the villages where we worked had actually seen a hornbill. So in fact, I wasn't able to attend this trip. My dad had just died. But my colleague told me that when Bukato, one of the members, he saw the hornbills in Parque, he was stunned. And that's when they actually decided that yes, conservation was worthwhile. They talked about hornbills, but here they were in incredible numbers. The communities there were protecting them. And in this photograph on the left-hand side in red is a Gaon Bora. He was an elderly gentleman. He had seen the British in Nagaland. He had seen the war, the battle for Kohima being fought, but he was so enthusiastic. He came on this trip which the communities were taken on to Kaziranga, to Arunachal, to Pake, to Honama, just to expose them to community conservation efforts across the Northeast. Intensive sessions were actually held on bird and butterfly conservation. And what's interesting is not everybody becomes an expert. Not everybody can later identify the butterflies. Not everyone is interested. But through these sessions, people become interested in nature. And now a lot of the young boys, they are actually taking photographs of birds and butterflies. We had an active, we still have WhatsApp group where they would share all their photographs and their sightings, and it became an easy way to actually communicate. I mean, they were in the Northeast. Luckily, they had quite a good connection there. They could access the internet, and we were sitting here, and it's like real time talking to each other all the time, and it has made the bond so strong. But the other thing was we tried to follow a volunteer model. We were a small group of people. So we asked people to actually come in. Very often, those people would pay for the travel costs, but it was a wonderful chance for them to see what was in these areas, which birds and butterflies could be found there, to take photographs, to identify the birds and enjoy themselves in the process. And they were actually contributing to the entire project, because that's how our list of birds and butterflies and moths grew longer. In this picture is Binanda. Binanda Hatu Barwa is a really well-known bird guide in the Northeast. He was a boatman who became phenomenal at identifying bird calls. So when Binanda actually came into the village, we asked him to come to Sky and scout around, see what he could find there in terms of the birds. He actually pointed out this Hodgson's frogmouth. And I remember one evening, it was late in the evening, and suddenly he heard a sound. We couldn't hear anything. And then he sort of called it back. And then he said, wait, there's a Hodgson's frogmouth here. And sure enough, when we shone our torch, there it was. And that was our first sighting. Since then, we've seen it almost every time. Our last ecotourism meet where we took communities, there was this lady, Mona, and she was like, it was dark. We were going on a walk through the forest. We were going owling. And she points to this black blob, literally. And she's like, what's that? And then suddenly we all get excited because it's a Hodgson's frogmouth. So that, now that's how you can see it really easily quite close to the village. There was a lot of mapping of biodiversity which was carried out, but most of it was trying to understand what the local knowledge, what the local names actually were of the birds, of the plants. And so, because we were at that time preparing what's called a People's Biodiversity Register, which basically documents all the folklore, all the knowledge associated to biodiversity, whether it's agricultural biodiversity or natural biodiversity. And that's where I actually got to read and talk to them and hear about all these different stories which they had about why the neck of a crimson sunbird is crimson. And we were able to learn together. For many of us, it was new, working with communities, training them, talking about birds and butterflies. We didn't really know how to do it, but we had a lot of friends, all the people who volunteered, who came in, they would help us. Somebody would say, oh, okay, I can talk about, marketing, or I can talk about this, or I can talk about ecotourism, or I can train them on this. People contributed. Sushil, I remember, contributed camera traps. People contributed in numerous ways to actually make this very successful. This is just a view through the lens of the local community. These are just pictures that they have shot. They're not the best pictures. These were just random pictures which I picked up. But they were taken by the local people, all of them. So this is just some of the butterflies. None of these are very rare in the area. They're fairly common species. Some more butterflies and even some moths, because you wouldn't think they would be interested in moths. They seem really dull. But with the right kind of teaching and excitement, people, and because it's easy, all you have to do is put up a white screen under a light, the right time at night, and you'll get all these moths actually appearing there. They're so much easier to see than birds, in jungles where they're being hunted. So a lot of people actually started taking photographs, trying to identify them, trying to go to moths of India and butterflies of India and all the different websites there are. So what can conservation achieve? So I'm not saying all this has happened because of the conservation efforts, but it's very interesting. The squirrel it's the right hand side of my screen. We'd never seen it there in many years. We'd started working in the area, I think from 2014 or 2015. I mean, we about 2 years later, we suddenly saw these squirrels. They were everywhere. They were in the fields where normally they would have been hunted out. But that was an indication they were not being hunted because they were not shy. You could see them everywhere. And the fact is, we still don't know what they are. We don't know what subspecies they are. One is supposed to be carrying out DNA testing, but we haven't just got around to doing it. Then this bat, which this friend of mine, this colleague Yatish had seen in Kivakha village, we don't know what it is. I've sent it around to some of the people, to Rohit, to try and identify, but who knows? It may be even new to science. It may be a range extension. We really don't know. But what's interesting is this Malay tree shrew. Earlier you wouldn't see these animals so easily, but on our last biodiversity meet, Alo, one of our colleagues, was just walking down the road. He's a local butterfly expert, and he shot a photograph of this shrew. And snakes are always, they're kind of hated, they're hunted. And now we actually see live snakes. We're seeing so many species. This is a mandarin trinket in the area. So much has actually changed there. And what I'd like to say is that people become more aware of conservation. Not everybody has to be a great biodiversity expert. I am not. A lot of the other people are not. But at the same time, there's a respect for nature which actually comes about through these programs. I couldn't resist this Guns and Roses. It's literally Guns and Roses. But this is a symbolic gesture on the part of the community, because the church is so important in their life, in their community. They actually made an offering of their guns at the altar to say that they would not use them to hunt wildlife in the future. So that's a huge sacrifice, and we had nothing to do with this. I mean, we were sitting in Delhi. They just made this decision on their own, because the people at the village councils, the people there are very active. They keep having meetings. They keep discussing things. Everything is very, very transparent amongst the local communities. And when they're enthused, they're very, very proud of their heritage, and they make sure that that everybody contributes to this process, whatever activity they actually decide to do. So they also have the sanctioning resolutions, and believe me, if somebody is caught hunting, they have huge fines. I was quite shocked. 25,000 rupees. I can't imagine paying 25,000 rupees, but they actually fine people that amount. So very, very stringent amounts to make sure that people fall in line. A lot of this was all of us working together and volunteering. So we actually, for tourists, came up with signboards. Well, we actually just designed the signage of the specials in the area, whether they were the moths, whether they were the butterflies like the Naga sapphire, or whether they were birds. And a lot of people volunteered photographs. I remember for birds, I asked a lot of people, can you send high-res images? But most people didn't have high-resolution images of these birds, which are not seen so commonly. And so a lot of people chipped in and actually painted the birds and the signage. So these community programs, you may be working with an NGO, you may be working with a big organization, but getting other people on board is a wonderful experience for everybody. And this is the logo which was eventually designed for the Tisa Biodiversity Conservation and Livelihood Network. It has the Tisa river running through, it's running through the forest, through the villages. The footsteps are the people who are walking beside it and conserving the area. And the bird and the parrotbill and the Naga sapphire represents their biodiversity, but also what would be important for ecotourism in the future. So we had a biodiversity meet. It was actually Nagaland's first biodiversity meet. There are different kinds of tourists. Some people would be hardcore interested in butterflies and birds. Others would want to look at the hillsides and just enjoy the beauty of the area. So the first meet was more targeted towards people who would come in and actually identify and document the biodiversity of the area. And because of all these efforts, we now have a species list of about 200 butterflies from the Tisa Valley area. We have 220 species of birds. And here's a photograph. We were told by Anguli Mease, who's Nagaland's leading bird guide, that he had seen the spot-breasted parrotbill on this hillside in one of the villages, Kivaka. So all the tourists in 2018, I think it was in around October, they went on this really steep path to try and see the parrotbill. Unfortunately, we didn't see it, but we saw a lot of others. We saw the gray-headed parrotbills and the greater rufous-headed parrotbill. And Naga wren babblers can be heard really very, very easily in that area. And of course, crested finchbills become very common after a while. Initially, they're gorgeous birds to actually see. Now, some of the birds at the end of the slide are in an area where another NGO is working, FES is working. It's Suruhu, where you actually have the Blight's dragon. Not that you can really go there and see it so easily. You have to clamber up over cliffs and all kinds of streams to actually reach the place. I didn't go, my colleague actually went there. But you can see Blight's tragopans there. And it's one of the, it's part of the Satoi area, which is a very, very rich biodiversity area. It's part of the IBA as well. So the ecotourism experience was really interesting. These are the kind of houses we would stay with the local communities, enjoy their orchids. It's fun to see all their old hunting trophies, which they adorn their houses with. But they're simple facilities. And I would like to say, if you want to be a responsible ecotourist and you really want to enjoy an experience in these areas, live life on the wild side. Don't expect all your comforts. Live simply, but enjoy every minute of it. Some of you may recognize this photograph of Sunita. She was wonderful. She really was able to communicate with the local people. In the evening, we would have all these local dances, but eventually it became a mingling of some Naga traditional dances and Punjabi Bhangra and what have you. And so there was a lot to do. You could go bird watching and butterfly watching in the morning. Then just sort of, sit by the river and enjoy beautiful, beautiful mountains, and then have a nice bonfire in the evening and watch all the dances. And so there's so much which you can actually enjoy. And I'm saying this because I know a lot of us are birders, and we have a long list. We want to get 300 new species a day if that's possible. But sometimes to encourage, because we always complain that you don't see birds in the area, but we need to sort of decrease our expectations, lower them a little bit, and work to enjoy what you do get in those areas. There are lots of moments of drama. And I had a lot of actual video clips which I had to remove. This was interesting because this greenish warbler had got caught in this massive spider's web. And normally one would leave it there because it's part of nature. Nature is red in tooth and claw. But in this case, we actually did try and save it. But it was interesting for the people because Ibito, who's in this picture, actually climbed up a tree. He disentangled the bird really, really very gently, and then he released it. So you have a lot of drama when you're actually in the field. It's a simple life. Don't expect comforts. On the left-hand side, you're up on top of a mountain. you're eating outdoors. What could be more beautiful? But on the other side, we were in Hunama where we had to go birding early. So we just packed up breakfast and end up eating it on a car bonnet. I had a video to go with this, but expect this. And people, so you have to have a really good spirit when you go watching birds and wildlife in these areas, because especially our first set of ecotourists, they ended up spending a night in the car and they got stuck both on the journey to the villages on the way back. Because this is what happens: you have rivers of mud, there are no roads there, and that's a big impediment to ecotourism in the areas. It's a huge impediment, really. Now, I'm sort of winding up my talk now. I just like to say that the heroes of conservation, I haven't put everybody's photograph up, but right in the middle is Ivan, and I hope he's joined us today and later will be able to say a few words. Ivan is amazing. He is the man who has pulled together this entire conservation effort. He works in Zuniboto, and it's an hour and a half terrible drive over those crazy roads to actually reach the villages. And he was always in the villages, always talking to the local communities, always inspiring them, telling them. Half the time, a lot was lost in translation to us. We couldn't understand Sumi. We couldn't understand Nagamese also. It was only Hindi and English which we would talk in. But he was the one, and he has played a pivotal role throughout this. We have actually, in a sense, moved out of the area now. We are no longer carrying out a lot of activities there. But he is the one who has propelled this forward. We also have, there's so many on the top hat, which is actually a binocular case, is Vihoto. Vihoto we call Mr. Moth, but initially I called him Mr. Moth. He was really good at moth ID, which is incredible. But now he's just good at IDing anything. He takes these amazing photographs of snakes, of butterflies. He actually goes to all the websites and identifies them. And he's one of the people who has an amazing talent. We, in the red shirt, we have Bukato. Bukato was always full of life and energy, and he would go to neighboring villages and talk to the communities there, try to get them involved. Right in the middle, we have a lot of the youngsters, and a lot of them have gone into, managing camera traps in the area, becoming photographers. And it's just amazing how they've gone from, their traps to actually just using cameras and all their bird guides and butterfly guides, and it's really worth visiting and seeing. And so Ivan actually carried forward this effort. So Chengu is a great barbet. It's a timekeeper of the Sumi community. And he organized this amazing festival where he got experts from all over Nagaland together, and there were bird walks and butterfly walks and painting competitions. And these are pictures of some insects and a moth. And what's interesting is this lady was brought in who does something called pebble art. And look at the wonderful pictures she's made of them. They're exact replicas, but they're made with pebbles. They're made with stones. So all this has happened on its own. But it's Ivan and all the other local communities who have actually worked together to make this such a thriving conservation community. They also received an award. It was a special recognition, a special mention. I think they should have received one in their own right, but this was in the initial stages when they had just begun their conservation work. So I had said earlier that there are a lot of community conserved areas, and what's interesting is most of them are privately owned, which means they face a lot of challenges and threats. I mean, a lot of them, there's illegal timber felling, which actually happens there. The local communities get no financial support for these community conserved areas, and very often they actually have to go in and patrol the areas. And it's difficult because instead of doing something productive and getting paid for it or working in their fields, they have no money to actually do this. It becomes difficult for them. And so we had tried to bring about a policy for community conserved areas. We actually drafted it, but unfortunately it was never really adopted. But I think all of us need to think about how much conservation is actually happening in Nagaland. So if you want to read more about the story of Tizza Valley, you can actually, I've given the links and you can just do a search for them. There's some more serious articles. These are the fun articles. There was a beautiful documentary produced by the Nagaland Forest Department and Terry, which was done by Gurmeet. It's called Nagaland is Changing, but it describes the sky experience as well as a more well-known conservation example of Sendinu. And I would urge you to actually download this video and watch it. It's so very exciting and so very interesting. I have to acknowledge Terry. I mean, all this work was initially started. I have recently left Terry, but all this conservation work, the projects I worked on were carried out there with our small team. And there's been enormous support for all these activities. And the Nagaland Forest Department were wonderful. The initial projects were given to us by Lokeshwar Rao and then Pangar Jamir. And in fact, special mention of Tukaho. I don't know if he's here watching this, but whenever we got stranded on the sides of the road, somehow we would call him up and he was always there. He was always getting us out of scrapes and troubles. Once we ran out, there was this big strike, we ran out of petrol and diesel, and I called him up and he came running to help. He was always there, and there were so many others of the forest department who supported us in every way. Our funding came through Conservation International Japan via a Jeff Satoyama project, and Yoji and Devon were amazing. I mean, they were never critical of any of the efforts. They used to come to evaluate activities, and they would always participate in them and would be so supportive. So thanks to everyone who has made this entire initiative a success, and especially to the Tizza Valley, because now the Tizza Valley is completely independent. They are carrying out activities. There's this butterfly month which is happening. They are a part of it. They are so active, so amazing, and I hope that they spread the message across Nagaland. I just like to say that this is in memory of two people who supported our movement throughout. And just last week, we heard that Shri Shikato, the Gaubura of Ghaki, had passed away, and that's really sad. And on the right-hand side is one of my favorite people. He had these eyes of a bird, and he would sing and tell all these folklore stories about the area, and he passed away a few years ago. So these people, this talk, this effort is in memory of them and their support. And the fact that people of their generation, with their stories, with their knowledge, not only of history of the tribes, but of wildlife, they are all disappearing today. So it behooves us to actually record and understand all the traditions before they die forever. So I just like to say, Ush Kimti, I just hope that I haven't lost you anywhere. I've been really scared about the electricity issue. And I would like to urge you next year to come to Nagaland, to come to see the Moor Falcons, and to come to visit the Tizza Valley area. Thank you.
Thank you, Pia. That was an absolutely fascinating talk. I think Sanjay is trying to get Ivan on the call. While we are waiting for that to happen, I don't think he's online yet, but we can just maybe go through a few Delibird talk announcements.
Sure.
And also for all the viewers, the chat box has now been opened. So in case you have any questions for Pia, you can just post them there.
So I don't think Ivan is on. I don't think Ivan is online.
Oh, that's a pity. We were hoping that Ivan would come and actually talk to you himself, but he's on the top of a hill somewhere in Zuniboto. So who knows about connections? But I hope that one day you will get to meet him in person.
So I can.
Sanjay, let me just go through these 2-3 slides quickly, and then we can just go ahead with the question and answer session. Right. As most of you would know, one of our partners for these talks has been Sanctuary Nature Foundation, and all the viewers of the Delhi Bird Talks are entitled to 1 year of free digital subscription to Sanctuary Asia magazine or Sanctuary Asia Cub, which is a kids magazine. All you need to do to get your free digital subscription is go to the Delhi Bird Foundation website, which is www.delhibirdfoundation.org/offers. You'll need to give your email address there and you'll receive an email with the next steps on how to activate your free subscription to Sanctuary Asia magazine. The next is that the Delhi Bird Foundation's YouTube channel is now live. So recordings of all previous talks and all future talks will be available on this channel. So you can just go to YouTube, search for Delhi Bird Foundation and subscribe to the channel to stay tuned to all the updates. Next week, we have a talk by Varad Giri, who's going to be talking about whether we need reptiles and amphibians, and if they're important, why they're important. So this is on Sunday, 13th September at 5 p.m. India time. The Zoom meeting ID is going to be the same one as this one. So hope to see you there for this talk as well. Now I'll hand it over to Sanjay to take forward the question and answers.
Thanks, Kavi. I see a number of questions coming in on through the chat box. So the first question is from Nayantara. You displayed a graph on factors contributing to community conservation, which had a low count for cultural association as a motivation. Could you elaborate on this? And if so, how can these stories help to encourage community conservation?
Nayantara, welcome. I'm glad you could join this talk. What's interesting is that most of the major reasons for why people actually conserved little patches of the forest were resource-based. So wildlife was disappearing, or some of the streams were drying up, and agriculture productivity was going down, or wildlife was just disappearing. So that's why they actually created these community conserved areas. But cultural associations, as I had mentioned, they are followed. Some of the traditions are followed, but unfortunately, a lot of the actual folklore and practices have been eroded today. So that's one thing which we were trying to do through this project in the Tizza Valley, is record the cultural associations. And some of them may seem meaningless today because people have forgotten their stories. But if you actually, like the hornbill, the fact that they don't kill hornbills during the breeding season, if you actually try and understand them, they're very meaningful today in terms of how you can practice conservation. But unfortunately, we've just started understanding a lot of these myths and stories. And so now we need to work closely with communities to document these more intensively from the perspective of conservation. And in fact, I hope at some point I get funding to do exactly that. I hope that answers your question, Nayantara. And I'll be happy to share the documents and other information with you, which you've been requesting.
Thanks, Pia. There's a question from Apurva who's saying that the Hornbill story, is that from the Sumi tribe or is it from the Mishmis? I mean, what's the origin of the...
This one is the Sumi tribe. It's a Sumi tribe story. But there are a lot of similarities between the stories which are told by various communities. There are slight differences sometimes between them. But this particular one, in fact, I should have shared the source. If you can send me an email or something, I'll actually send it to you if you like.
Okay, there's another question from Nivedita. How would the pandemic affect the conservation and livelihood story at Tizza Valley? And how are they dealing with it?
That's an interesting question, because what we have found is not in our particular area, but across Nagaland there's been, and the Northeast in general, there's been a lot of recording of hunting and poaching supposedly increasing. A lot of people have been publicizing that. We have not actually seen any of that in the Tizza Valley, because the fact is the people seem to be committed to actually carrying out conservation. It's not because they're following any imposed law or Wildlife Protection Act. But I wish that Ivan was here to tell you about the difficulties they're facing because they've not been able to, go out of their villages and travel around Nagaland. So it's been difficult for them, even in terms of their Zooming practices and actually getting financial support to market some of their goods and supplies. So it has impacted them. But in terms of actual increases in hunting and poaching in the Tisa Valley, I don't think it has had an impact.
Thanks, Pia. There's another interesting question is, would the inclusion of traditional folklore in environmental education in local schools help young children to develop a connection with the natural and cultural world? Was this something already in place? And to this question, I will add the fact that one of the things I noticed when I went to Tisa Valley first is that there are no young kids. And I think, Pia, you can answer as to why, what happens to the kids there, and how the locals actually educate the young today.
So it's really interesting because traditionally, yes, these were oral traditions and this was how you passed on knowledge to all the youngsters. But unfortunately today, they're only primary schools. So all the kids in the village actually move out of the area. So they're moving into Kohima, into Dimapur, outside Nagaland for their studies. And many of them are not coming back. They don't want to Zoom any longer. And I remember when I was a kid and my dad would tell me stories about his granddad and what they used to do. I'd be like, oh, daddy, yeah, sure. So the fact is youngsters very often are not interested in hearing all these tales. But I think it's important that the schools, wherever they are, even if they're outside the villages, if folklore becomes an important part of their curriculum, but not just in terms of learning stories, in terms of actually relating them. And the fact is kids come back on holidays, they come back during the summer, they come back for Christmas especially. So during that time, it would be really important if they could be told some of these stories. Because it's kind of sad. Part of it was because of the language issue, but I actually found that Hutton had recorded more stories than I was able to actually hear from the people. So if we're losing that, then we're just losing out on a form of environmental conservation and our heritage.
Pia, here's another question from Nayantara. Christianity has its own creation myths, stories, and legends. How do stories from older Sumi culture and those of Christianity interact? And have they led to new stories and new beliefs, or have they led to a loss of the older ones?
That's really interesting. I don't think I've looked at it in that depth to see whether it has inspired a new set of stories or whether actual parallels have been drawn between, the Old Testament and the stories from the Bible and the various tribal communities. At the same time, like I mentioned, in Vokha district, they've invoked the Bible, the stories of the Bible, to actually bring about conservation. But I think that a lot of these have actually sort of disappeared. The young people are no longer aware of some of these stories. And so that's why it needs to be revived. In fact, a lot of these traditions would still be being practiced today if it wasn't for changes in religion, changes in various other political and cultural situations.
Okay, Pia, there's another question from Anirudh Bahl. Where can we get more information about Naga folklore and stories?
So what I found was that the British colonial writings, they give you a lot of information about particular tribes. And then you just have to go online. And there's a lot of recent writing from various Naga individuals talking about their traditions, trying to record it. So you'll have to look at I looked at lots of sources to actually put together the ecological history of the Subi community. But whatever is available, a lot of it is available on the web. Just start searching for their folklore, their myths, their tribal stories.
Here's a question from Manjula. How do you as an NGO and the community work with the government, as they're supposed to be biodiversity management committees as part of the biodiversity management focus of the state, including documentation and conservation of bioresources?
So what's interesting in Nagaland is again the ownership pattern of forests. So the local people are very independent that way in terms of how they actually manage them. But we really worked closely initially, especially with the forest department, to document their folklore. And the forest department was really flexible because we didn't follow the PBR, the People's Biodiversity Register. It has a sort of format which you have to follow, and we didn't follow it so closely. We actually documented a lot of information which would seem extraneous per se, including all the folklore. But I think the PBR formation is becoming all about numbers, you know, that each village must have one. And so you need so many villages and so many PBRs. And it's losing out on its essence of actually getting the kind of information you need, because ultimately this recording of culture is supposed to lead to livelihoods as well, in terms of identifying particular plants and animals which are important commercially. So for example, the Naga Mirch has a geographical indication tag today. So I think the PBR process, all that needs to be followed, but the youngsters who are really well educated today, as far as possible, they need to start documenting their traditions and their knowledge. But the forest department has been supportive of all the activities. But the local people are very strong in Nagaland, and they maintain their independence. So it's not a bad equation, really, I think. They have a lot of flexibility. It's not as if their viewpoints in any way are just going to be subsumed by NGOs or by the government or by other.
Yeah, actually, I'll just support what Pia is saying, that especially in Nagaland, and probably more so than any Northeast state, the local community controls and manages their forest, and the forest department per se has a very limited quote unquote role. Of course, the number of PAs in Nagaland are also very few, so that is another reason.
Yeah, there are about 4 or 5 actual government PAs in Nagaland. The rest of them are small sanctuaries which are created by the local communities itself. So so that's why, in one sense, it gives you a lot of flexibility to actually come in and work with communities and decide how the forest can be managed or protected. The local people can draw up their own management plans with the help of NGOs. So that's why NGOs are important in terms of providing technical guidance. But what we found is that because a lot of people don't work in that part of the world, it becomes difficult to tell them, you know, these are the species of trees, for example, which you can be planting in the area. So this is what you can actually do on the ground. Because the botanical information, for example, is very limited. We really had to struggle, for example, to get some of the tree species in our area identified. So there's need for enormous amount of work in Nagaland, truly so.
So Pia, Ramya wants to know about, the local community is giving up hunting on a voluntary basis. Given the fact that a lot of the hunting is for subsistence and for, eating, their own dietary requirements, what alternatives do they have? I mean, how can they, where can they make up commercially for what they've given up, or even for subsistence?
So that is the biggest problem, and that's why throughout the talk I tried to talk about how we shouldn't be imposing our ideas on others, because it's a fact that the Wildlife Protection Act, it bans hunting entirely, but the local communities really depend on it, on their wildlife for subsistence, also for cash incomes, which helps to pay for their kids, for example, to go to distant cities to study there. And to a great extent, there's actually no real alternative. The only alternative we could think of was ecotourism, but it's not easy to do because they're far-flung areas, and whenever you try and come up with some kind of an ecotourism example, there need to be species, with biodiversity based species, which will attract people there. So if you look at the eagle nest example in Arunachal, it's really very successful, and the local communities are able to make a substantial amount of money through tourism. But it has a lot of its own inherent strong points which have made this possible. They've discovered a new bird there, entirely new to science, a Bougainvillea chichla there. They have a lot of altitudinal variation which allows them to see a number of different species of birds belonging to various niches. The roads are easier. You can actually walk on the road and actually do some of the surveys. So this is a really difficult and it's a really vexed question which we all face, and what the local communities ask us. So personally, I know that there's laws and there are policies. Personally, I think it's not a good idea to ask people to just give up hunting entirely unless you can give them some kind of alternative. Having said that, I would say that the people have a lot of livestock for their nutrient requirements. They have pigs and they eat dogs, and they have chickens, and each village you go to will have a lot of livestock, but it's still very difficult. So when we would go to the area, they would often give us fish and say, see, we had to get it from the local market. We didn't actually catch it from our areas for you. So you have to look at alternatives. If you're stopping for a few seasons or so, have certain closed seasons for fishing in that particular area, then you should have some aquaculture ponds. And that even in the local community have been very good at doing, actually bringing in all the other government departments to give them training as much as possible on a wide range of activities, whether it's beekeeping or whether it's aquaculture. But in a sense, I'm really evading your question because I don't have the answers to it. Because I have worked for so long in Nagaland, I understand how some consumption can possibly be sustainable, but we don't have the numbers on it. We don't really know. And so it's very, very difficult to do because it's related to the culture, to the lives, to who the people are, to their identity. It's like going to a community in India and saying, you can't eat biryani or you can't eat this. How can you expect people to give up what their identity in a sense? So I really don't have the answers. We've been trying whatever way we can, One way to do it is just to talk about future generations, because the youngsters will not see all these species. The Hornbill Festival happens, but you don't see hornbills. So that's the only way. If you want to do it, you have to do it for yourself. We are not here to tell you to do it.
Yeah, Pia, I'll just compliment what you just said is, one of the key things is that obviously what Terry has tried to do in this landscape is to incentivize conservation, and ecotourism is one way of doing it. But another very key issue, at least in Nagaland and in a lot of places in the Northeast, is local pride. The fact that the people in Tise Valley have taken the lead in community conservation is a great deal of pride for them. And so it's not always only economic factors. I mean, economic factors are important, but there are other factors also that can motivate local communities to protect their own resources. And you'll be glad to know, Pia, that Ambika here is asking when's the next meet and whether she can join.
So Ambika is an expert who's looked at hunting and communities across Arunachal. So it's wonderful to hear that from her. And maybe Ambika is a person who has some of the answers and solutions. But I think it's going to be next November or next October when the Amur falcons come in. And in fact, I plan to actually do it, whether I do it on my own or whatever. Let's see, we'll work it out. So I do hope you'll actually join me in October.
In fact, Pia, I hope you remember, I still remember when we did the first meet, there were 20 people who landed up. And as Pia mentioned, we had vehicle breakdowns on the way in and on the way out. And you will not believe it that at the end of the visit, the first question that we were asked was, when's the next one? So the fact that despite the hardships, I mean, it was an amazing visit. So people wanted to come back. So this is just the last question now before we wrap up. Rangaswamy wants to know, well, it's not a question. It's actually a request saying that if all the stories related to birds, butterflies, animals are published in the form of books, it would be very helpful for future generations. So any plans to do that, Pia? I think he's talking about the local stories rather than the biodiversity documentation.
No, I know what he wants, and I actually want to do that. I'm trying to look for funding to look at conservation, to look at at all these stories. But honestly, I'd like to say it should come from the local communities. The youngsters of today should actually bring out this kind of information, because there'll be so much of the nuances that we're going to lose in the process. So I really plan to do it, but I would like to see more of the Naga youth doing it themselves as well.
Okay, thanks a ton, Pia. I think we can wrap this session up. Kavi, you want to take
Thank you, Pia. Thank you, Sanjay. And thank you everyone for joining us.
Thank you all.
We'll see you all next week for the talk on reptiles and amphibians with Dr. Bharat Giri.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you.